And then, quite suddenly, he knew he was not alone. It was not that he saw or heard a presence. He felt it, like the warmth of a fire at his back, powerful and gentle at the same time. And so immediate was the pressure of that personality. It might have been in his very spine. He bent his head in terror, hardly breathing. He allowed the presence to do what it would. "I am here," the presence seemed to say. "Do nothing. We are here." Locke looked away over the river to forget his hunger. He flared his nostrils, and immediately was rewarded with a whole mixture of smells. For the mist from the fall magnified any smell incredibly, as rain will deepen and distinguish the colors of a field of flowers. There were the smells of the people too, individual, but each engaged to the smell of the muddy path where they had been. But before I could close the door, the incorrigible schoolmaster in him had called me back. "I tell you something which may be of value. I believe it to be true and powerful, therefore dangerous. If you want something enough, you can always get it, provided you are willing to make the appropriate sacrifice. Something, anything. But what you get is never quite what you thought. And sooner or later, the sacrifice is always regretted." She came down the stairs and stood, and there was nothing to do but look, nothing needing to be said. She took a scarf, her father's, I think, and we went out together. We went to a blackened-out pub and sat hand in hand, both stunned by this overwhelming sense of recognition. We kissed, then and there in public, without shame or bravado, because although people stood within a yard of us, we were alone. And we both recognized, without a moment's doubt, that we should never let each other go. I came up out of my cabin at about 0800, when Valkyrin and Vestkapelle light were in sight. The rest of the assault was proceeding in, about a mile on my starboard bow, with the landing craft stretching astern. The first shell made my heart beat quickly, and I tried to stop my teeth chattering, because now I knew it wasn't going to be an easy assault. The radar began to show up assault craft and Vestkapelle, and finally I decided to cut loose and run in. Odd shells were dropping here and there. I was feeling unhappy, but fairly fatalistic. I was worried about the obvious balls-up that the rockets were making. He looked at the water, then at each of the people in turn, and they waited. "I have a picture." He freed a hand and put it flat on his head as if confining the images that flickered there. Mal is not old, but clinging to his mother's back. There is more water, not only here but along the trail where we came. A man is wise. He makes me take a tree that has fallen and... His eyes, deep in their hollows, turned to the people, imploring them to share a picture with him. At last, Ha spoke. "I do not see this picture."
Showers.
He eyed the peculiar shapes that lay across the trousers indifferently for a while, until at last it occurred to him how strange it was that lobsters should sit there. Then he was suddenly seized with a terrible loathing for lobsters and flung them away so that they cracked on the rock. The dull pain of the blow extended him into them again, and they became his hands, lying discarded where he had tossed them. We had one of those interminable, reasonable conversations about the relationship between men and women. One would not be jealous. One would understand enjoyment taken with a third person. Nothing was permanent. Nothing was more than relative. Sex was a private business. Sex was a clinical matter, and contraception had removed the need for orthodox family life. And then suddenly we were clinging to each other as though we were the only stable thing in an earthquake.
And then we realized it.
Once or twice I was drunk for more than a day. I said unforgivable things to Anne and pulled her about on at least 3 occasions. The rawness of daylight pushed at me. The presence of David exasperated me. My inability to write fretted me, and I drank. The figure was a child, drawing nearer. He was naked, and the miles of light lit him variously. A child's stride is quick, but this child walked down the very middle of the street with a kind of ritual gait that in an adult would have been called solemn. His face was so swollen he could only glimpse where he was going through the merest of slits. It was perhaps something animal that was directing him away from the place where the world was being consumed. Perhaps it was luck, good or bad, that kept him pacing in the one direction where he might survive.
In the arts, there was enmity directed against him.
These are the good fellows whose duty it is to steer our ship, to haul on the ropes and do strange things with our sails in positions which must surely be perilous, so high they go. All this I watch with complacency from far off in the shelter of the wooden wall with its stairways that lead up to where the privileged passengers live. But forward, beyond the white line which separates the social orders, the people work and sing, and keep time to the fiddle when they play. For like children, they play, dancing innocently to the sound of the fiddle.
Rites of Passage is the first in a trilogy of novels which chronicle a voyage from England to Australia in the early 19th century. It is a monumental late work in which Golding pursues his constant themes of class, myth, the border between reality and unreality, and man's capacity for inhumanity.
It's a voyage that takes a year from Tilbury Docks to Sydney Harbour. The overall headline of the story is trying to get from one end of the earth to the other by sea, using ropes and pulleys, canvas and wood in order to try and battle against the ever-changing, ever-unpredictable and unmasterable sea.
And the capacity for cruelty that we all have in us and which we have to control.
No, I'm not ready. No! No! Please!
Rites of Passage centres on the public humiliation of one of the passengers, a parson who gets drunk, has sex with one of the sailors, and then literally dies of shame.
A low and filthy fellow who must be cleansed!
At one point there's a crossing of the line ceremony where they go across the equator and Neptune arises and there's this big sort of festival, and the Reverend Collie is the subject of the dunking, the sort of ritual to take one of the passengers and sort of baptize them. And it's very, very fierce. I think Golding's always been fascinated with that, how closely we rub up against barbarity, and that within the blink of an eye you can have something very civilized and seemingly in control turn into something that is monstrous.